Okay, hi, so this is Mr. Kufs. We're doing review sessions right now. We're doing Reconstruction. The Reconstruction era happens between 1865 and 1877. We call this era in American history Reconstruction. Why do we call it Reconstruction? Jill? What are we doing? What's the word mean? To reconstruct is to do what? Rebuild. We're rebuilding what? The country. Why? Because the Civil War is the context. If you're writing an essay, 1861 to 1865 is the Civil War. This is the context that leads to Reconstruction. Reconstruction is an actual plan that Lincoln, Congress, and then Lincoln dies, Andrew Johnson, each come up with. Who's the strictest of the three? Congress. This is the strictest. Why? Because Congress is dominated by radical Republicans who want to punish the South. So their plan is a stricter, harsher penalty for the South. Lincoln's plan is more lenient. Why? Because Lincoln wanted to preserve the Union and unify, and thought through leniency he could transition the country and get his goals for African Americans and all his goals through, and didn't need to overly punish. Johnson's plan is very lenient. Why? Because Johnson is sort of a racist and is actually a Southerner himself. So punishing white Southern former slave owners is not what Johnson wants to do, even though he's not a slave owner, he's a mountain man. What plan happens of the three? Congress. Congress is the plan that happens. Why? Because Lincoln died. A historical question: had Lincoln lived, would Lincoln's plan have happened? Yes, he had clout. Lincoln had clout. And because Lincoln had some clout, had he lived, the plan would have definitely happened. Okay? So Lincoln plan, Congress plan, Johnson's plan. Congress plan, 50% loyalty oath, a harsh transition for former white Southern slave owners, property confiscated. So those Southern states are going to take a while to transition back into power. What this means is, and this is a good thing, is we're going to see the first congressmen that are of color, that are black. Hiram Revels. The first black senator, the first blacks in the House of Representatives. I believe there were 9. There won't be another Southern black for 100 years after Reconstruction ends. 100 years. So what happens in this time frame? Well, they split the country. My beautiful map. They split the South into 5 zones. This is not the scale. And these zones will be overseen by the United States military, so that the whites don't mistreat the blacks during the era.
What do you call those?
Military zones, military reconstruction zones, 5 of them. To rebuild and to help transition African Americans. Because the military's there, it leads to what? A hate group forms in Tennessee called the KKK. Why did the KKK form? Because they couldn't have their hate for black people out overtly in public, so they were forced underground. Why were they so angry? Because they were white former Southern slave owners that were stripped of what they saw as their livelihood and their way of life. And they were, to use today's words, racists. So, What ends up happening during this Reconstruction period? Well, as the years roll on, the resentment builds. Different southern towns come up with things called black codes. What are black codes? Those are local laws to punish black people. Like what? Like an African American can't testify in a trial if the crime was committed by whites. Their testimony is not needed. Like an African American can't work certain jobs, can't go certain places. So what this is essentially is the beginning of what we call Jim Crow. What is Jim Crow? Jim Crow are laws of legal segregation. What is segregation? What is segregation, Ireland? The separation of the races legally. In 1896, the Supreme Court said it was okay in Plessy versus Ferguson. And until what case? In 1954, was it okay to segregate in public things? Brown versus Board of Education in Topeka. Imagine that. We lived in a country that said it was okay to keep races separate as long as it was equal. It was never equal. It was inherently not equal. So, Jim Crow laws are laws of legal segregation. And they wanted to keep African Americans, once Reconstruction ended, from voting because they were so mad that before they were allowed back in to vote, that blacks got voted into Congress. So they came up with methods to keep them from voting. Can you remember any of those horrible tactics?
Grandfather club.
Well, that was the last ditch. First it was poll tax. Then it was you got to learn to read. But they realized whites couldn't pay the taxes. Whites couldn't read. So they came up with this ridiculous grandfather clause that said if your grandpa didn't vote in 1860, you can't vote. Well, guess what? None of these, at the time, slaves in 1860 could vote if they were African Americans, so it kept African Americans from voting in the South. Okay? This is what's happening. Was there any federal organization in these towns that helped African Americans? Was there a federal bureau? Yes. You know what it was called? The Freedmen's Bureau. Excellent. The Freedmen's Bureau was to give an education for the freedmen. The Freedmen's Bureau was to educate, medical attention, and jobs. All throughout the South. The Freedmen's Bureau for freedmen. Do you understand that? Now, ultimately, there were 3 amendments passed just before or during the Reconstruction era. All of them helped African Americans substantially, if not immediately, down the line. Like the 14th Amendment is part of the reason that Brown v. Board, the justification of Brown versus Board of Education. What are those 3 amendments? Do you remember those? What's the 13th Amendment? It's a simple one.
Slavery.
Abolishes slavery. These are known as the Reconstruction Amendments. What's the 14th Amendment? Equal protection under the law. What's the 15th Amendment? Voting or suffrage for all males. Universal male suffrage. Why do you think that they were able to get amendments passed during Reconstruction after everything I've just told you? There's a really good reason. Because it's hard to get an amendment passed, but what was happening in southern states before they were let back in? The white former southern slave owners weren't voting because they weren't allowed back in yet. So the blacks in the South, the former slaves, had power. And through that power, look what's happening here. Through that power, they're getting amendments passed with the radical Republicans, the anti-slavery people from the North. Do you think these amendments would have passed if the southern former white slave owners ran those southern states at this time? No. Probably not. But the 13th Amendment was really important to President Lincoln before he died, and it happened before he died. The other 2 happened after he died. The other 2 happened after he died. Now, once Grant got elected president in 1868, there was so much scandal and corruption into the 1870s that we start to see the country worrying more about money and less about what's right to do in the South. And it all comes to a head with the end of Reconstruction has to do with the election of 1876, and that's the last thing I want to talk about here. The election of 1876 ends Reconstruction. The election of 1876 leads to the Compromise of 1877. Anybody remember the candidates in this election? Hayes is the Republican, and a guy named Sam Tilden from New York is the Democrat. It takes, at this point in history, 185 electoral votes to win. Tilden has 184, Hayes has 165, 20 are disputed because of election improprieties and questions. A single vote from Oregon, and then the rest are from Louisiana, Florida, and South Carolina. Nobody knows who won the election. Oh crap. They got to reach a compromise or do a backroom deal, and what do they decide? They'll give all 20, which he needs every single one of them, to Hayes. He wins by 1 vote. He gets the White House. What does the South get? They get the military to leave so that they can treat blacks like crap for another 80 years and end Reconstruction. Oh, and they get a railroad. To the South, it's like, thank God. You know, when the cat's away, the mice will play. Yes. Finally, the U.S. Army's not breathing over our necks. We can lynch African Americans. We can torture them and keep them from voting with no accountability. Yeah, we gave up the White House. We sure would have liked the Democrat to win, but who cares? Who cares? Rutherford B. Hayes gets the White House, the 17th president. The Republicans will continue to wave, oh, there's another one of my props, to wave the bloody shirt is a tactic to remind voters that the Democrats were the cause of the Civil War, and they will dominate electoral politics and dominate the South in Congress until FDR in 1932. But the white Southern former slave owner racists will get to treat blacks like crap for another century because Reconstruction ended, which leads historians to ask the question, was Reconstruction a success or failure? And that is the most loaded question in the course, perhaps. Reconstruction was both, in some ways, a success and a failure. Reconstruction was good intentions and dumb intentions. Reconstruction was a little bit of anything. And if that's an essay question, be prepared to write about it and to take a position. I'd use the word although or the word but. Does anyone have any questions? Keegan.
Can't say completely neutral on it?
Yeah, well, you'd say although. You could argue both sides. Yeah, of course.
Oh.
Say yes, Reconstruction was a success because it gave the African Americans amendments and did other great things, but it was a failure because once it ended, life for blacks was as bad, if not worse, for a variety of factors. That'd be a good one. Valerie, question.
What exactly is the 14th Amendment?
Equal protection in the eyes of the law. It's basically citizenship for anybody born here. Any other questions? Valerie.
You said that the Reconstruction Amendments got passed while the white, like, Southerns couldn't, like, they weren't let back in?
Yep, because the white Southerners were not, they didn't have enough of the loyalty oath to be allowed back in the state, or the states weren't in the Union yet. So they were passing it without even Southern states being in the Union to vote, so they were reaching the 75 state legislative percentage and the 2/3 vote in Congress threshold a lot easier, because the racists that didn't want that stuff weren't there. What else?
Didn't it go to the election? Didn't it go to a group of people and the majority were Republican?
Yeah, 8-7, and that helped it. And that was also the 8-7 vote was the way that Andrew Johnson, because he went against the radical Republicans, they impeached him in this time frame for violating the Tenure of Office Act. That happened. He was the 17th president after Lincoln. The radical Republicans hated him. Any other questions? Okay, we'll stop right there. That's Reconstruction. Very quickly,